My name is Murthy Muthuswamy. I'm a scholar of radical Islam. I made this recording in the aftermath of the jihadist attacks in France conducted in January of 2015. It has become clear that radical Islam has gone out of control. Even though in the past 14 years since 2001, countries such as the United States have spent well over $2 trillion battling it. Thus, it has become clear that we need new ideas, perspectives, and even strategies in order to understand and to defeat radical Islam. I believe that understanding Sharia is crucial to understanding radical Islam and then to defeat it. I'm saying this on the basis of my recent academic publication in Albany Government Law Review Journal. Here is my name, you can see. This article is available for free on internet and it is titled Sharia as a platform for exposing violence and as a cause for waging armed jihad. This trend of Islam is dominating Muslim communities is a new one. In fact, if you go back 50 years ago, secular dictatorships were ruling better part of the Muslim majority nations. There are other evidences of secular domination. For instance, especially in cities, in general, people wore, especially educated ones, wore Western dress. They hardly had any facial hair, especially beard. And that situation is very different from what is happening now. Many of the secular dictatorships have been deposed, and the ones that are left, such as the one in Syria, are fighting Islamists. Now, the dress code of Muslims not only in Arab nations, even in Indonesia, Malaysia, or Pakistan, have moved away from Western type of a dress. One also sees more evidence of facial hair. If we can understand why the Islamists are dominating secularists at this time, we can perhaps understand what has been causing Muslim radicalism. Toward that end, I want to go back another 50 years to a total of 100 years ago. So at that time, not only Muslim nations, even non-Muslim developing nations saw an infusion of secularism and modernity emanating from Western nations. Populations in general willingly embraced this modernity because it led to a better quality of life. However, that threatened the status, power, and prestige of religious ideologues all over the world. This is true of Muslim communities as well. However, in Muslim communities, the ideologues framed the necessity of following religious principles in a very clever way. These ideologues said that Muslims need to adhere to an all-encompassing divine law called Sharia. This is using the words such as divine, law, and all-encompassing. It's a very powerful way of nudging Muslims to follow this type of ideology. This brings up the question of what is Sharia law. Sharia is a feature of Islam that is not discussed in Muslim Holy Book. What it is an interpretation of Islam in the eyes of a Islamic scholar. Because Sharia is not written, its interpretations vary very widely, and in fact, in sometimes it can even be contradictory. This is unlike a modern law, which is written down and that limits the or narrows the scope of interpretation. Because Sharia laws represent a lifestyle of about 1,000 years ago, it is medieval or anti-modern in its outlook and interpretation. It also defines how a Muslim should live on a day-to-day basis, how they should relate to each other and to non-Muslims. Since it's a very complex law, ordinary Muslims who believe in Sharia law have to rely on clerics or religious scholars for the appropriate interpretation. And this is what gives Muslim clerics and religious ideologues influence and power over Muslim masses. Once they have this power and influence in a community where Sharia is popular, they have a chance to push other ideas also as on the basis of the Sharia platform. One such agenda a subset of clerics have always pushed is the idea of armed jihad. Armed jihad, as an interpretation, has been around for centuries in Muslim communities and it has been practiced. But then again, because it is a religious doctrine, a cleric has to invoke it. The Sharia platform gives these clerics who advocate jihad, armed jihad that is, a platform, and this is the reason why we now have militant groups operating around the world, because Sharia's popularity has also gone up, as I will discuss later. So who are the leading ideologues who push this narrative of Sharia? Starting in 1900s, Al-Banna in Egypt, and then in 1940s and 50s by Sayyid Qutb in Egypt, and then later in 50s, 60s and 70s by Abul Maududi in Pakistan, and then in 70s, 80s by Ruhollah Khomeini in Iran. They all urged Muslims to live by the Sharia laws. But because Sharia laws are medieval in their construct, it doesn't encourage wealth creation. So if Muslims had just followed Sharia law without any other form of financial support, they would have lived poor. But then again, who wants to be poor? People want to feed their children. People want to give education to their children, to have them see careers and so on. What happened was, oil wealth was able to give that financial incentive for people to follow Islam the way religious clerics want them to follow and still enjoy a good financial well-being. In other words, oil wealth made it possible for Muslims to have the cake and eat it too. The countries that inherited oil wealth, such as Iran and Saudi Arabia, are among the most prominent and influential of Shia and Sunni nations respectively. Saudi Arabia went beyond that. Starting in the 1970s, Saudi Arabia propagated the kind of version of Islamic practices called Wahhabism. Wahhabism emphasizes a literal and strict adherence to Sharia. It also encourages armed jihad under certain circumstances. Saudi Arabia also, as the birthplace of Islam and host to two holy mosques, had the additional prestige of being highly Islamic nation. The Saudi educated Wahhabi clerics told their flock all over the world that if they practice Islam the way Saudi Arabia does, including the way it practices Sharia laws, Allah would reward them with oil wealth. Obviously, this is a great encouragement because Saudi Arabia was and is still very wealthy. On top of that, Saudi Arabia also sponsored and supported armed jihad both financially and ideologically in the form of the Afghan Islamic Jihad directed at Soviet Union. This led to, in a modern context, for the first time, a new generation of Islamic fighters who came from all over the world to Afghanistan and learned how to wage jihad. The influence of Sharia on Muslim communities have been very significant. I'm going to quote for you some data from Pew Center polls. In 17 out of 23 nations with large Muslim population, the majority of the Muslims surveyed considered Sharia to be the revealed word of God, just like how they perceive in Saudi Arabia. And then in 25 out of 38 nations, the majority of the Muslims surveyed favored making Sharia the law of the land. And those who supported making Sharia as the law of the land, in 10 out of 20 nations, the majority supported corporal or physical punishments such as chopping off the heads of apostates who convert to other religions, and also cutting off hands of thieves. The kind of punishment Saudi Arabia practices under its Sharia laws. This Sharia support among population, including the strict Sharia versions, also creates conditions for militant groups to thrive, that is. In fact, in Pakistan, Nigeria and Iraq, we have got Taliban, Boko Haram and the Islamic State waging jihad to impose strict Sharia laws, the kind in practice in Saudi Arabia, on the local population and replace the existing mix of Sharia and secular laws. You may have a question. What happens if these type of Sharia measures are not popular among majority community in Muslim nations? Predictably, the answer is that in some such nations are moderate, they achieve socio-economic development. Turkey is one such example. However, unfortunately, the link between Sharia and this radicalism has been overlooked by Western policies. For example, in France and in Britain have established Sharia codes for their Muslim communities. In the US, in a 2014 address, President Obama called on Muslims to reject the ideology of organizations such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State without even connecting the ideology with Sharia. So, what we now realize is that more so than the religion, the real issue or the issue that we need to address are these narrative of Sharia that articulates that it is an all-encompassing divine law. Just like we waged a war of ideas on Soviet communism successfully by discrediting the underlying ideology and pointing out to them the advantages of capitalistic democracy, we not only need to point out the good things we stand for, but also undercut the ideology of extremism, which is the narratives of Sharia. By doing so, we can help Muslims coexist with us and make socio-economic advancement and move forward like the rest of us do.